Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Charter for Compassion's With Compassion podcast. My guest today is Marina Cantacuzino, author, journalist, and founder of the Forgiveness Project, which shares extraordinary stories of people who have rebuilt their lives after trauma, violence, and loss. For more than 2 decades, Marina has explored forgiveness, not as a moral demand, but as a deeply human response to suffering. Marina, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Jennifer.
Now, you founded the Forgiveness Project after years as a journalist. What was the moment when forgiveness stopped being an idea and became a necessity, or something that you really wanted to focus your work on?
Yeah. I've been working as a freelance journalist, feature writer for 15 years, very happily, actually. And then it was the time of the Iraq War, and the drumbeat for war was ever present, and there were marches all over the world about this invasion of Iraq. And I was just felt so convinced that it was the wrong way to go. I was convinced the harder you come down on people, the more they regroup and reemerge as angry and resistant. So I often think it was rage, actually, that got me into the work of forgiveness.
There's an irony.
Yeah, absolutely. But so as a journalist for the next year, I thought, what can I do? I've got a very small voice, but I have got a voice. And I was traveling quite a lot with a photographer for jobs to do with journalism. And I just said to him, why don't we, in our spare time, seek out stories that are in a way a counter-narrative to the narrative of today, which was all about payback and retaliation and tit for tat. Why don't we find stories that focus on forgiveness, or the whole territory of forgiveness, which includes compassion and empathy and reconciliation and personal stories, stories from victims and perpetrators, stories from those who've been harmed and those who have harmed, and look at processes of healing, essentially, and restoration, and how you reconcile with grievance. That's what I was interested in. And because we were traveling, we went to South Africa and Northern Ireland and America and Israel, I just found stories, and I didn't know what would happen to those stories. I thought maybe it'd be a big article in a magazine. But Anita Roddick, who was the founder of The Body Shop, a social activist, sadly since died.
It's a big chain in the UK. I don't know if other people will have heard of it, but it was a very ethical brand, and she was an extraordinary campaigner herself, wasn't she?
That's right. She was extraordinary, and she saw the raw material that I created with the photographer, which was very journalistic in form. And she said, you have to do something with these stories. They're so powerful. They're so authentic. And she gave us funding, money, to put on an exhibition, which we called the F Word, Stories of Forgiveness. And that was in 2004. And I thought my life after the exhibition would go back to journalism. I had no intention of spending the next 21 years working on forgiveness. But it was just so successful. The exhibition was phenomenally successful. People were queuing up around the corner of the gallery to get in. The catalogue sold out within a couple of days. The media reach was into millions. And it was quite clear that my life was going to be taken into a different direction, because people were saying, you must do more, please do more, use these stories. Can we use these stories? And that's why I founded the Forgiveness Project, which is based on storytelling and these, what I call restorative narratives.
And you are a journalist, so stories are your natural, I guess, medium. Why stories in relation to forgiveness, though? What is the power of storytelling in this field able to do you think?
Well, I always knew as a journalist that stories stick, whereas facts fade. Real stories, personal narratives. Those were always the stories that people became invested in, I think, which grew empathy and compassion in people because they could walk in the shoes of others, much more than facts or figures or opinion. So that's why I wanted to work with the lived experience, if you like. And I also think when I mentioned restorative narratives, I mean, stories are powerful. We know that. Every business or charity or author uses stories, but they can be just as harmful as they can be helpful. So, they can fan the flames of prejudice and normalize hate. So the stories that we work with at the Forgiveness Project are what I call, you could say, redemptive, restorative narratives, which focus on empathy, compassion, forgiveness, and show people ways through, basically. How do you heal after harm? How do you reconcile with grievance? How do you create a more compassionate family, environment, world?
And are there commonalities between people's stories? Is there a formula or a methodology to forgiveness?
Um, there is a kind of, I've sort of mapped attributes, if you like, that lead to being able to forgive. And they are a reconciling circle rather than a vicious circle. A vicious circle is one where you are harmed and you're so trapped in your grievance that you end up wanting or actually harming someone else, and that can go round and round. And to break out of that into a more virtuous sort of circle, if you like, is to actually think, why was I harmed? Why did that person hurt me? Did I play any part of it? Can I actually heal better by letting go or accepting or having a sense of compassion or empathy for the person who's hurt me? Can I possibly forgive? And a lot of it starts with curiosity, actually. The one sort of single thing that I found common to every single story, apart from a growing sense of empathy for the person who's hurt you, which is very hard if it's an extremely horrendous thing that's happened to you, but is curiosity in the other, wanting to understand. Because I think we can get trapped in certainty very often, black and white thinking. And there's something about greyness to forgiveness. I haven't got everything worked out. I don't understand, and I'm willing to not understand.
So it sounds as if it involves almost a relinquishing of one's rightness and one's victimhood, in a sense. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's also a recognition and a making peace with things we cannot change.
So an
Um,
acceptance of
yeah,
reality of what's happened, with no matter how terrible,
yeah,
that nothing that can be done to change what has happened.
yeah. And it's not about eliminating the wound or the hurt. It's about actually moving closer towards it and reimagining a relationship with it. That's what I find so interesting about forgiveness, because people often say it's about letting go. And I think it is to a certain extent, but it's not about pushing things onto the carpet or forgetting. It's about reimagining and just having a different relationship with the harm. What I found from many of the stories is that people, and sometimes they feel guilty about this, are able to just accept it as part of their life and not try to push it away, So it's about, I think people often mistake forgiveness and reconciliation as the same thing. But you don't have to reconcile with the person who's harmed you, but you actually do need to reconcile within.
And can you give an example of that process you've just described of almost going towards the thing that's hurt you rather than just trying to keep it as far away as possible?
Yes, there's this woman called Carmen Aguirre who was a victim of rape as a young person. And she became a sort of creative person in her adult life and wrote a play, um, a, very much based on her own experience, and performed in it. She needed to perform in it to understand what it was like to be a perpetrator. or writes the part of it. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And she actually went on in restorative justice, where a victim communicates or meets with their offender. She actually went on to say that she actually felt that the event of the rape had taught her about compassion, because it was like a radical compassion that most people probably barely can understand. But when she said that the only way, compassion was the only way to transcend the violence of rape, I understood that. It's like a lifeline. It's like self-preservation. It's sort of, I think it was Primo Levi who says, I do not hate because I do not want to be like them, you know, the Nazis who put him in a concentration camp. And I fully sort of get that desire to sort of clean yourself from within almost, and to embrace all the goodness in a way that compassion, feelings of compassion, empathy, and forgiveness will bring you in order to sort of move on and let go and create a new chapter. People often talk about a new chapter or a new life or a new beginning. And I think that's what I've always found interesting about forgiveness in particular, that it has this ability to help people start over when they've been so trapped and ground down by something that's happened to them, whether it's a small thing or this big thing.
And something people sometimes say is that isn't forgiveness letting your perpetrator get away with what they've done?
Yeah, and it's not to say that doesn't sometimes happen. I mean, there's a dark side to forgiveness, and there's plenty of research that says that if you keep forgiving someone who's been violent towards you in a relationship, that violence will just continue. But Desmond Tutu often talked about you can forgive and release, or forgive and renew. He said, don't be a masochist, don't stay in a toxic relationship, walk away. But in your heart, you can feel lighter by forgiving that person. But forgiveness and justice are two very different things. And some people will require justice in order to forgive, and that's their prerogative. So they require confession and contrition, and you call that conditional forgiveness. And it's the position of many. It has to be earned and deserved. But then you've got a whole other school of thought which says, well, what happens if that person's dead? What happens if that person's incapable or unwilling? Does that mean that I'm not able to forgive and, have a better feeling in my heart as a result of that? Am I going to still be tied to the perpetrator and inextricably linked to them forever? And for those people, forgiveness has nothing to do with justice. It's entirely to do with yourself and self-healing. And there is and I think you can have multiple, you might feel very forgiving in one circumstance and not in another. It's very fluid and it's not fixed, rarely fixed. One day you might forgive, the next you might hate all over again because something's triggered you.
So forgiveness isn't a one and done process. Then it's event rather. It's a process that you have to revisit and
Yeah.
revisit.
Yes, I would say mostly. There's always exceptions. And there's definitely stories I've got for people for whom forgiveness is an epiphany. There's one man called Shad Ali who was beaten up in a racist attack and left for dead and woke up in hospital the next morning so badly beaten and bruised and needed multiple operations for years after. But it was like he felt his instant reaction as he came to was, what had happened to that person that they could possibly have seen me as so inhuman and wanted to hurt me so badly? And he wanted to forgive. From that moment, he forgave. And it was like a self-preservation again. And as his friends were calling for revenge and wanted to go out in the street and find this guy, he begged them not to. He said, no, I want to forgive. He hadn't expected to do that. It was almost like, it's quite interesting the way it can come to people. Often actually some of the restorative justice stories I've had where a victim meets the offender, they don't go in that meeting to forgive, not at all. They go into that meeting to get answers and to feel empowered. But very often they do in the end forgive because they see that person as human. Remorse is an acknowledgement of great healers, and they see forgiveness as something they want to offer as a way of mending and fixing and starting again.
And how important is that meeting with the perpetrator when it's possible in the process of forgiveness?
I think it helps, but I don't think it's necessary, and it's not always possible, and it takes both sides to be willing and to be in the right state of mind, and it can be a very unsafe process if that isn't the case. But I mean, I've met many people who forgive who've never met and don't want to meet the person who's harmed them. Um, and as you said, Jennifer, a lot of the stories the Forgiveness Project has collected is quite extreme. They are to do with often to do with violence and murder or terrorism, sexual abuse. So we're talking about things which most people probably would think are unforgivable. And I think that's only because forgiveness in everyday life, in all of our lives, with our relationships, um, is quite easy to understand. I think forgiveness is the oil of personal relationships. We kind of know that. We probably do it multiple times a day. And we also know of relationships we have where we can't forgive and where, actually that relationship doesn't survive because we can't forgive, or they can't forgive us, or they're very angry, or they ghost you, or, whatever it is. We all know those things. But with something very extreme, I think in the interviews that I've done, I've really wanted to unpick it. How is this possible? We're not hardwired to do this, surely. What led you to it? And every story is very different and every process is different. But I think I've learnt something from every single story I've done and interviewed and written up, or sometimes we do podcasts or we film them and put them in the stories in exhibitions, or stories told live is also very powerful.
I wanted to ask you about that, the impact on you personally of hearing these stories, how it's changed your process of dealing with maybe the more commonplace slights and hurts are a natural part of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I got into this work in the beginning is that I'm not I hate conflict, and I always try to build bridges. That's in my character. So that's possibly why I was very interested in forgiveness, which is quite an extreme version of mending and repairing. Um, and I think, I mean, I get a huge amount of inspiration from these people, but also a reality check in a way to not think it's the panacea for all ills, and certainly not to be judgmental around it. There are times when maybe I can't forgive or others can't forgive, and that's the right thing for you at that moment. It's not necessary. There's a little bit of judgment that can be put on to those who work in the field of forgiveness, that if you don't forgive, you're failing in some way. And I don't like that. And I never wanted the Forgiveness Project to embrace that aspect of it. So the stories are nuanced. And for instance, there's a Israeli father whose young teenage daughter was killed in a suicide bomb in Tel Aviv many years ago, actually now. And his story to me is very interesting and powerful because when you meet him, I know him quite well, he exudes a forgiving nature. You'd say this man is just so empathetic, so compassionate, so understanding. And yet he says, I do not forgive and I do not forget. But the suicide bomber was made angry through shame and poverty and was a victim like my daughter. So there's this sense of understanding and not judging and wanting to build bridges and to make a better world. And I call that the territory of forgiveness, the landscape of forgiveness. And within that landscape, he says, I do not forgive and I do not forget. So those stories are really important.
So there's an incredible complexity to what you're
Yeah,
describing.
there has to be. Yeah, because we're living in this world of binary narratives and inflexible opinion. And I think forgiveness doesn't fit in that for me.
And of course, what we're seeing in the world is a march in the opposite direction. We're seeing a rise in the level of hate, othering, lack
Yeah.
of understanding. What hope do you have for forgiveness on a bigger societal or national level right now?
Um, yeah, I have to hold on to hope because it's all we've got and things change. I mean, the fact that everything always changes is hopeful, I think. But we are living at a time, I think, where empathy and compassion are seen almost as a threat, and where, you know, stories of forgiveness are being edged right out of the public space. Well, I say that, and yet there's a thirst for them because they bring people hope. So this is why the work of the Forgiveness Project, I feel, is more important than ever, actually, at this time, because we're trying to create and shift the narrative, which is so focused on authoritarianism and you know, um, I'm right, you're wrong, just such judgment and opinion everywhere. That I think these more nuanced, complex stories of compassion, forgiveness, empathy have huge power, but they struggle for oxygen, you know.
You said a moment ago that compassion and forgiveness are experienced as a threat. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, I think because we live on, we're living in an era where any sort of compassion for the other, whether it's about trans rights, refugees, people of color, we're living in an era that I never thought I'd quite see, where people are so demonized and dehumanized again. To speak personally, I've got 3 children, 2 of them are gay. I never thought I'd fear for their safety in the world, but I do. And, that's something to do with the world that we're living in. And the absence of compassion, I think, can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation, a family, an individual. And that's what I see happening. But again, that's why I think the work is more important than ever.
And what keeps you going when you hit those moments of fear and despair about the state of the world?
Definitely the stories and the people I've worked with and their their commitment to sharing their lived experience with others, because stories can shift hardened hearts and rigid thinking in a way, as I said earlier, that I think nothing else can quite.
And we're talking about forgiveness on the level of individual to individual. How does your work map on to when we come to nation states or peoples that have experienced wrongs, whole groups of society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's much more difficult. It's such a interpersonal thing, forgiveness. It's very easy to kind of understand when you feel hurt and harmed or been hurt or hurt others. But I think, you can't legislate for forgiveness. And if people try, they can easily become unstuck. There was with Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was apparently, I spoke to one of the architects years ago, and he said, at one thought, we wondered whether to make forgiveness mandatory. And then we saw sense and decided not to, So, but there are places in post-conflict societies. There is a place where forgiveness can be very powerful. And, Sierra Leone, for instance, among the communities, a bit like in Rwanda, where perpetrators and victims were being forced to live back together again. What do you do with that dynamic? And there was some very interesting work done around forgiveness bonfires, where people came forward, shared their stories, people who'd harmed others, offered sincere apology and remorse and acknowledgement, and were forgiven and brought back into the community. So it can happen on a group level. I think it's not so easy, but can actually, when I thought about what was happening in Sierra Leone and to a certain extent in Rwanda, it's much more effective than making laws in the glass towers of The Hague.
So it starts with individuals.
It always starts with individuals, and it can be encouraged by groups, but not over-encouraged. There's some suggestion that in Rwanda, there's a little bit of a sense that if you do not forgive, this is coming from the authorities, if you do not forgive, you may not get that funding. Or, so forgiveness is very much out there, that it has been encouraged that society must forgive in order for the violence not to happen again. When you can see the logic in that, absolutely. But if it's coerced, it can become a tyranny. That's my concern sometimes.
And it sounds as if forgiveness sometimes isn't the right thing to do, that there may be a psychological function in not forgiving yet.
Yeah, and I think it can be a moral decision not to forgive. There was definitely a woman I met who had been raped, and she understood the psychological health benefits of forgiving, because there was a lot of research out there to show you have better health outcomes if you can let go and accept and not think about it all the time. But she said, in solidarity with other women who have been sexually assaulted, I will not forgive. So that was a very conscious decision in a way, which is interesting. But for others, it's a sense I do not see forgiveness as condoning or rewarding bad behavior. But some people may see it as that, and they might say, I don't forgive, but nor am I sort of consumed with hatred. There are many ways of dealing with harm.
And for anyone who's listening, who this may bring up people that they feel unable to forgive at the moment, what would you say to them about how they can deal with that?
Well, I think some people don't want to forgive someone, and that's fine. It's the people who want to forgive but can't. And I always say the same thing, because, lots of people work in the world of forgiveness, and there are people doing 5 steps and 10 steps and methods and what have you. And of course, you can always do that and Google that and find out what to do. But my preferred way is to read the stories, because even if a story isn't related to your situation, you will learn something from them. Because people have been, we've got nearly 200 stories now told on multiple platforms. People are always very open and revealing about what led to it, and it's a process, and you go through many stages, and you can go back and forward and in and out. And I think people have told me, the only reason I'm saying this is that over the years, I've been contacted by so many people in many ways for saying thank you for the stories. It's really helped me in my life. I mean, just recently, a woman just said it had made her changed her relationship with her ex-husband completely by being exposed to forgiveness stories over the years. She'd had a very, very bitter feelings towards him for a long time. And that had totally gone just from being exposed, as she said, to the work of the Forgiveness Project.
Of all these incredible stories, just to finish this incredibly rich conversation, and I do encourage everyone to look at your work online, the Forgiveness Project. It's extraordinary, and also your books and your writing. And if you have access to the BBC, you've made some fantastic radio programs on it as well. But just to close, can you tell us a story of forgiveness that we can take away with us to provide us with inspiration and hope?
Okay, it's good in a way just for me to suddenly think of a very ordinary story, actually, because there are a few of those as well that we share, definitely, because people relate so strongly to them. There's this guy called Carsten Mathiasen who's Danish, and his story is like his wife leaves him when he's got 2 young children, and he's very, very bitter and shocked. And he has a sort of campaign of hatred towards the new man in his wife's life, starts ringing him and threatening him, one thing or another, and just thinking and obsessed and full of rage and hatred until his daughter says to him, "You should meet him. He's not bad. He's quite a nice guy." And, to Carsten's credit, he decides to meet him, realizing this man's going to be in his life and his children's life for years. And what he describes is very powerful in a Copenhagen cafe meeting. Another human being who was a gentleman. And he said, I liked him immediately. He was open. He was curious, going back to curiosity. He was curious. Who is this man who's going to spend time with my children? And then he describes how they become very good friends and for years. And it really helps him get over the loss of his marriage. And then this guy, the man who's gone off with his ex-wife, gets cancer, and this is years later, he's in a hospice, and Carsten goes and visits him, and then eventually he dies, this man. And Carsten says, the day he went out of my life, I cried the way I did when he came into my life. And it's a beautiful story of empathy, of compassion and forgiveness. So many people would not have got to that point, but actually what did it was Carsten deciding to meet him in a cafe and see him as another human being. Sometimes that's what it takes.
Marina Cantacuzino, thank you so much for your incredible work and for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lovely to talk to you.